The scholar bowed, accepting the task with a promise that he'd get it done as soon as possible. Roland nodded in approval, but he couldn't help noticing the scholar seemed like he had something more to say. So Roland asked him, "What is it?" The scholar then pulled out a book, asking why are all these mathematical textbooks all labeled as intermediate, looking quite puzzled. Roland chuckled and glanced at the scholar. "Because beyond this," he explained, "there's something called advanced mathematics. It's not just geometry or arithmetic, it's like a grand mix of all the higher-level theories." Roland paused for a moment, then added with a grin, "If the scholar thinks of the beginner and intermediate books as the trunk of a tree, advanced math is the branches spreading out at the top. But, again, it's ridiculously difficult, which is why it has another name." The scholar's eyes widened, brimming with curiosity, then asked about the other name. Roland then crossed out the old name and wrote "From Beginner to Giving Up." The scholar blinked a few times, clearly not getting the joke. Instead, he took it seriously, replying with absolute sincerity, saying he would never give up. Even if it takes his whole life, he will master it. He just wanted to have a look. Roland, feeling a bit awkward now, clears his throat and tells him before that, he would have to finish this task first, and then come to the castle for the book. After leaving the mathematics department, Roland headed to the backyard of North Slope Mountain. There, he and Anna got to work on some blueprints. By the time night fell, Roland stumbled out of the workshop, yawning. However, the good news is the weapon was finally ready. Now, all that was left was to wait for those pesky demons to come knocking again. 5 days flew by quickly, and once again, there were sightings of the demons riding on the beasts in the distance. Roland wasted no time and called everyone into the hall for a meeting. Pasha frowned, clearly concerned. Believed this was a bit too soon, based on past experience. The second wave usually comes 2 weeks to a month later, especially for cities like Neverwinter, which can't be reached in just a day. Roland then asked, "Why is that?" Pasha explained, "It's to let the rumors spread. By the time word gets out and the panic sets in, no matter what promises the lords make, the second attack will completely shatter the mortals' confidence." Roland thought for a moment. Before he could respond, Alethea, looking anxious, asked, "So, what's the plan?" Without hesitation, Roland replied, "They take them down." Sure, time was a bit tight, and the new weapon had only gone through one test run, but the witches were back, and this time they were prepared. And this time, no more playing defense. He looked over at Nightingale, Maisie, and Lightning, giving them a firm nod, telling them to just stick to the plan. However, he also instructed them that their own safety is the most important thing. The two girls raised their hands together, smiling, and said, "Got it." Nightingale chuckled while telling Roland to not worry, she will keep an eye on these two little ones. Lightning puffed out her chest, clearly not fond of being called the little one. Maisie chimed in playfully, saying when she transforms, she's bigger than both of them. Lightning, clearly not talking about that, grabbed her chest in frustration. But before either of them could finish their bickering, Nightingale scooped them up by the scruff of their necks and hauled them out of the meeting room, one in each hand. The room fell silent after that. For a moment, everyone was holding their laughter. Then Roland turned to Tilly, handing over the defense of the city walls to the slumbering owl witches. "I'll be here waiting for good news from all of you," he said with a calm smile. With his command, the entire city of Neverwinter shifted into wartime mode. Once everyone had left, Pasha, still on the screen, glanced at Roland. She looked a bit concerned. She asked him if he was really sure about this. She believed that the large presence of witches would make the demons rethink their approach. They'll realize this isn't a city ruled by mortals anymore, but a city of witches, which would cause their strategy to change completely. Roland gave her a reassuring smile, since she had already warned him about that. But they should be real here, this war is coming, whether they like it or not. It's better to fight with a plan than to get caught off guard. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. "The First Army wasn't always this strong," he continued. "At the start, they were just ordinary hunters, miners, and farmers. Now, they're facing an entirely different kind of enemy. But the more they fight, the more confidence they'll gain. By the time the real divine war hits, they won't be scrambling in a panic." Roland's words hit home for Pasha. She found herself moved by his resolve. It was moments like this that set him apart from the usual mortals, she thought. Roland smiled and added, "Mortals aren't called mortals because they're weak, but actually it's because there are so many of them. That's why their strength gets overlooked so easily." In the dream world, there were stories about immortal beings like ancient gods, fire dragons, you name it. However, they were all being brought down by 40 ordinary humans. Pasha's eyes widened in disbelief, wondering if there are really stories like that. Roland nodded with a mischievous glint in his eye. "And that's the point. If the demons believe Neverwinter is purely a witch city, they'll chalk up all the attacks to the witches' powers. But they'll be missing the bigger picture. Neverwinter isn't just an old human city, nor does it belong to the Federation. It's a fusion of both, a magic plus industrial city." As the scene shifts to the city wall of Neverwinter, a young soldier stands guard, his eyes locked on the horizon, terrified of missing any sign of the enemy. His mind kept flashing back to the image of the bone spear piercing through his comrade a few days ago, and a wave of fear gripped him. Just then, someone gave his shoulder a reassuring pat. It was Vainer, who threw an arm around him and said, "Don't worry, kid. His Majesty Roland's got a new weapon lined up. Those demons don't stand a chance against us now." Nearby, the machine gun crews were checking their ammo, double and triple checking everything. Suddenly, a soldier shouted from the watchtower, "Target spotted 10 o'clock." Everyone turned to look, and sure enough, a few figures were speeding toward them through the sky. Then another shout came, 12 o'clock, more enemies incoming. The young soldier, still shaking a bit, took a deep breath, loading his weapon and aiming it at the fast-approaching demons. The demons soon becoming clearer, and he could feel his heart racing. He remembered the drill sergeant's words, "If the enemy gets close enough to throw spears, don't hesitate, just shoot. But before that, don't aim at them directly. Lay down enough bullets in their path, and they'll crash right into them." The demons were in range now. Dozens of Vickers machine guns opened fire all at once, and soon one demon's canister exploded in a burst of fire. The heavy barrage of bullets brought down several more demons and their beast mounts. Everyone squeezed their triggers without mercy, emptying their ammo boxes in the good old American, or rather, Neverwinter way. Sensing the danger, the demons scattered, but kept charging forward. Now the rifleman joined in, picking off targets at will. The young soldier spotted one demon heading straight for him, already raising its bone spear. He realized he had a clear shot, but so did the demon. If he didn't shoot, he'd be skewered. If he did, well, same result. Faced with the choice of running or fighting, he roared in defiance, squeezing the trigger with everything he had. His bullets ripped through the beast's brain and caught the demon in the arm. The demon howled in pain, but it still managed to hurl its spear straight at him. He didn't back down. Instead, he kept pulling the trigger, his fear rising, but his legs stayed planted. He shouted, "I'm not a coward." Suddenly, a barrier appeared right in front of him, blocking the bone spear that was aimed straight at him. Stunned, he turned around to see a cheerful witch standing beside him. She was the one who protected him. With a grin, she said, "What are you talking about? Of course, you're not a coward." Up on the wall, the new weapon, or perhaps what Roland called anti-aircraft machine guns, adjusted their angles, firing relentlessly at the demons. The bone spears were either deflected or hit the stone walls, leaving no casualties so far. Bullets tore through the wings and bodies of the beasts, and that's when one of the demons blew a horn. That's when Sylvie reported through the communication rune that the enemy was starting to retreat. On the other side, Lightning giggled through the comms. "Message received. Now sit back and enjoy the show from the Great Explorer." Sylvie tried to warn her to be careful, but before she could finish, the sound of a rushing wind filled the air. In a flash, Lightning was already up in the sky, dragging Ashes along with her. The demons hadn't noticed them yet, and for Lightning, this was no different from the time she bombed the royal capital. Except this time, her bomb was Ashes. Ashes drew her massive sword in midair. One of the demons finally spotted her and tried to raise its bone spear in defense, but before it could do anything, Ashes sliced it clean in half, from the top of its head to the middle of its chest. Even the beast it was riding was cleaved in two. The other demons quickly turned, spreading out, and one of them began swelling its arm, preparing to throw another spear. But before it could act, Maisie, now in her massive beast form with Nightingale riding on her back, dove down from the sky toward the demons. Two spears were thrown, hurtling toward Maisie, but in the blink of an eye, she transformed back into her fat pigeon form, causing both spears to miss completely. The demons froze in confusion, but that split second was all Nightingale needed. She appeared in front of one of the demons, gracefully dodged its attack, spun in a 360-degree circle, and raised her revolver, taking it down with ease. Maisie transformed back into her beast form just in time to catch Nightingale. With a quick adjustment, Maisie charged toward the last remaining demon, who desperately threw two bone spears. But Nightingale activated her ability, flipping her mist world upside down. The spears missed her entirely, and in that instant, the demon fell from its mount. At the same time, Maisie crashed into the beast, while Nightingale grabbed the demon's head and used her dagger to finish it off. Maisie then caught Nightingale once again as Lightning and Ashes flew over to meet them. Nightingale pointed out two fingers at Ashes and said with a grin, 2-1, so I win. After landing, Lightning turned to Sylvie and asked if she could track down those two runaway beasts. Sylvie scanned the area carefully before nodding, saying they're about 5 kilometers away, but was concerned if it was safe to keep chasing. Lightning waved her off with a grin, telling her not to worry since Maisie is also coming with her. End of the day, they're just a couple of wild beasts without a master. Maisie, now in her pigeon form, perched on Lightning's head and chirped confidently, "None of them are getting away." Nightingale gave them a quick word of advice, reminding them to watch out for any gas canisters, while Ashes warned, if they run into more enemies, don't be heroes, just pull back. The two nodded, then took off into the sky, chasing after the retreating beasts. Meanwhile, back with Roland, a report came in, the demons had all been wiped out, and they had even recovered some gas canisters. On top of that, Leaf had managed to capture one of the demons, who was knocked out cold. And this defense had been an unexpected success. Roland smiled in satisfaction. For him, the most important part was the boost in morale for the First Army. His soldiers now knew that the demons weren't invincible. With a captive demon in hand, the city's efforts to teach the public would get a huge boost as well. Roland was confident that once the newcomers saw what the demons really looked like, any lingering prejudice against witches would start to crumble. And then there was the enemy itself. According to Pasha, Agatha was the best when it came to studying runes and magic stones, but some of the other witches from the Federation knew a thing or two as well. They could use the demon corpses to create more runes. At the same time, this battle had proven one thing: the Vickers 1 heavy machine guns were barely adequate for anti-air combat. Sure, they'd won this time, but that was thanks to the sheer volume of firepower they'd unleashed. At the thought of this, Roland couldn't help but wish for a true air force, one that could dominate the skies freely. But for now, he put those thoughts aside. A few minutes later, he called for Barav. Roland had decided to throw a big celebration that evening in Central Square, making it as lively as possible. It wasn't just about the victory, it was part of the advertisement effort too. Barav nodded, saying he understood what to do. That night, the celebration was in full swing. The entire city of Neverwinter came out to revel in the day's success. The next morning, a young boy received a letter. Remember him? It was Snake Fong. He's a friend of Paper, or he once tried to protect her. Back at Changgu Stronghold, he and his friends had been under the control of the local rats gang until Roland's forces cleared them out. After being rescued, Snake Fong decided to head to Border Town to work. Anyway, let's get back to the story. Tiger Claw heard someone knocking on the door and wandered over, curious. He thought today was their off day. Snake Fong waved him off, telling him it's not the boss so he can go back to sleep. He opened the envelope and found 2 letters, along with an official document. It was his Neverwinter residency card, which is the proof that he was now a recognized citizen of the city. Staring at his own photo on the card, Snake Fong felt a rush of pride. He'd finally become a part of this city, one of King Roland's residents. The second letter was a notice about his next assignment. He'd been selected to work on building the new railway through the forest. Tiger Claw, curious as ever, peeked over his shoulder and asked what it said. Snake Fong quickly pushed his face away, and didn't want to get his drool all over his letter while telling him it's just his ID and a job offer. Tiger Claw was happy for him and believed that this called for a celebration, and he planned to go get some fish and mushrooms for dinner. But when he found out that Snake Fong would be working out in the wilderness, he was a bit surprised, since he never mentioned anything about going out there. The reason he hadn't told Tiger Claw was because he was worried he'd want to tag along, which would leave their place empty. But Tiger Claw had no such plans. He'd heard about the recent events in the city and wasn't exactly eager to head off into the wild himself. He thought the wilderness was crawling with demons. Scratching the back of his head, he had also heard they're tough to deal with. If they were so easy to beat, how could they have driven humans this far out? According to King Roland, humans once had hundreds of cities and millions of people, but they still lost. Snake Fong nodded. He knew all of this too. But that's exactly why he'd signed up. 35 silver coins a month, with 6 months pay up front, and even the chance to buy a 2-room house. If he missed this opportunity, who knew when another would come along? Of course, the money was tempting, but he wasn't entirely reckless since safety was a big concern for him too. The good news is the main construction team will be protected by the First Army, and the witches are coming along too. So they won't have to fight, he tells his friend, trying to ease his worries. Finally, he picked up the last letter. It was a transfer contract. The document outlined that, no matter what happened, the city hall wouldn't withhold his rightful salary or any bonuses. In the event of an unfortunate incident, while working on an external project, he could choose someone to inherit his assets. Upon the contract's activation, that person would receive a notification from the city hall. He closed his eyes, thinking about his friends. After a moment of reflection, he wrote down Paper's name. Meanwhile, in the Kingdom of Dawn, a nobleman stood by the window, a wineglass in hand, gazing out at the city blanketed by night. He closed his eyes and let out a weary sigh. Just then, his son entered the room, telling him that Baron Alphonse from Northwind City had requested to see him. Without even turning around, the man dismissed the request. His son hesitated, about to say something, then waved a hand at the old butler standing nearby. The butler quickly left, closing the door behind him. This was the 12th nobleman his father had refused. Horn himself could also sense something was wrong at the palace. After all, the sudden arrival of so many foreign nobles made their intentions clear. "Father," Horn began cautiously, "if you keep doing this, they might start thinking." His father interrupted, then asked, "Thinking about what?" Horn pressed on, saying they might think their family is still loyal to NPN. The man called out his son's name, who was the future heir of their family. His voice was heavy as he questioned if his son really thought the 3 great families supporting his majesty was a mistake. Horn shook his head, saying that's not what he was trying to say, but rather he didn't think His Majesty needed them anymore. Ever since the army's crushing defeat, the king hasn't consulted his father once. His father is the prime minister, yet he can't even set foot in the palace. Not to mention even the patrols have been replaced with mercenaries, and the only people His Majesty calls into the castle are jesters, actors, and courtesans. The nobleman finally turned around and didn't say anything. He glanced down at the wineglass in his hand. He knew all too well the disaster at Hermes had left Anpian stripped of its military strength. Everyone had seen how pitifully the king had returned from the battlefield. The power Anpian once held could no longer quash the ambitions of the other nobles. Now, they were all waiting to see how the three great families would react, deciding whether to join forces against or pledge their allegiance. Horn was getting anxious. He tells his father that this isn't like 10 years ago. Anpian isn't the same as when he was a child. Even Otto is still locked up in the palace. His father is the prime minister, and the people respect him. If he just stepped forward and brought the other two great families with him, the nobles would surely rally behind. The man suddenly turned, his eyes narrowing dangerously, and asked Horn what he meant by stepping forward. Horn lowered his head. Stuttering, he replied that his father hadn't exactly sided with Anpian either. If he were truly loyal, he wouldn't be avoiding these nobles. If the old king were still around, his father would be personally persuading them to prioritize the kingdom's stability. The man's gaze sharpened, and asked him if he think Anpian doesn't realize this. Horn hesitated, also a bit confused. The man glanced out the window, as if sensing something. He is confident that there are several pairs of eyes watching this house right now. They're keeping track of who he meets and where he goes. If word gets back to Anpian that he's been speaking with these nobles, it's easy to guess what happens to him next. Although Anpian may have lost the entire night order, that doesn't mean his grip on the capital is weak. From the moment he was crowned, he's been replacing the palace guards with his own loyalists. This means by the time the man is standing at the gallows, strangled on a noose, no nobles will come and save him. The man slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising, asking Horn if he now understood why only the foreign nobles knocking on his door and not the other two great families. Horn flinched, his voice trembling, but asked then why not retreat to their own lands? His father still has knights, mercenaries, they could recruit more soldiers if needed. His father shook his head slowly. The Quin's family have been rooted here too long. They have branches, distant relatives, businesses, influence. Even if he could sneak out of the city, he couldn't take everyone with him. He couldn't afford to make such a rash move. The entire family would be dragged down with him. Staying here, pretending to be sick, that was his only way to ensure some kind of safety. He had no other options. Just then, a voice suddenly rang out from outside the door saying she didn't agree with that statement. Both of their faces froze, their heads snapping toward the door. Horn shouted, "Where are the guards?" Before he could even finish, the door swung open, and Andrea walked in with a calm smile. "Count Quinn," she said softly, "do you remember me?" For a moment, the count was too stunned to speak. The wineglass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The sight of Andrea triggered a flood of memories. His wife, his daughter. He remembered the day he personally handed his wife the death notice of their daughter. His wife had been so devastated that she passed away not long after. With a trembling hand, he pointed at the woman. "You've grown taller," he stammered. "And you look so much like her." Horn had never seen his father so shaken. From the way they were speaking, it was clear his father knew this woman. But who was she? It wasn't until Count Quinn finally called her Andrea. Then it hit him. This was the eldest daughter of the Quinn family, who should have been dead for years. The old butler was even more shaken, his voice trembling as he said, "It's really the young lady." He could never mistake her. The young lady inherited all of the lady's features. Andrea's face remained expressionless as she glanced at the butler. "So, you do remember me." But Andrea didn't waste time getting to the point. The count's thoughts raced as he remembered the painful past, which was the time when he found out that his daughter had awakened as a witch. He hadn't even told his wife. To protect Andrea, he had staged the drowning deaths of the servants who told him about the incident. It was also he who orchestrated the carriage accident. He knew it might make Andrea hate him. And yet, here they were, face to face again, and it was he who faltered first. The count then turned to Horn, telling him to leave. Horn hesitated and wanted to say something, but the count's tone had turned sharp, and this time, it sounded more like he was ordering him. Gritting his teeth, Horn left the room. The count instructed the butler to shut the door, turn off all the lights, and make sure no one disturbed them. The butler nodded but glanced uncertainly at Andrea, asking what about the young lady's companions? The count looked at Andrea for a second, then told him to take them to the banquet hall for now, emphasized that he should make them comfortable. Once the door was closed, the room fell into silence again. The count finally spoke, saying Andrea looks very much like his daughter, but he can't just accept her identity based on appearance alone. When he sent Andrea away, she was only 16. It's been 10 years and he needs proof. In truth, he already believed this was the real Andrea. He just needed a confirmation, something solid to convince him. Andrea didn't reply with words. Instead, she used her ability, shaping her power into a bowl. The Count's widened his eyes. He recognized it immediately, the very same bowl he had gifted Andrea's birthday all those years ago. This caused his voice to tremble slightly, asking, but why come back? He thought he sent her away so she could live safely, far from here. Andrea didn't see it that way. In fact, she thought the Count was just afraid of what people might say, something like, the Prime Minister has a daughter who's fallen to the minion of the demons, so she didn't think that's protection. To her, it felt more like abandonment. There's no such thing as safety for witches. If she hadn't been lucky enough to find others like her, she'd probably be dead by now. The Count wanted to respond, but no words came out of his mouth. He knew she wasn't wrong. Still, Andrea wasn't here to dredge up the past. Maybe he was curious about how she'd gotten inside. She explained that she had overheard everything he said from outside the door. At the same time, she asked about Horn, wondering when did she get a little brother. The Count hesitated, then explained. He's an adopted son from one of the family's branches. After a moment of silence, the Count tells her that her mother passed away a year after she left. However, the Quinn family needed an heir. Andrea got a bit upset hearing the news. For a moment, tears began forming in her eyes. But she quickly composed herself, her voice steady as she replied, no matter what, the Quinn family can't change its head right now. His Majesty expects him to move forward, not step back. Given the current situation, the only person he thinks fits the spot is Count Quinn. The Count blinked in confusion. But what did Andrea mean by that? Before he finished asking, Andrea replied that of course, she's talking about King Roland of Grey Castle. Andrea then tells him that she's here on his behalf. Shortly after she asked the Count if he was willing to become the new ruler of the Kingdom of Dawn, the Count staggered back, his legs became weak, and he wasn't sure if Andrea was serious. But Andrea's expression was unwavering, telling him Roland doesn't want to see Anpian remain on the throne, nor does he want a neighboring kingdom torn apart by civil war. To stabilize the situation quickly, a new, uncontested ruler is necessary. But the Count wants to know why Roland chose him. Andrea shrugged, saying because Roland doesn't know anyone else in the Kingdom of Dawn. He picked her first, but she turned him down. The Count couldn't believe it, just because she refused, so Roland handed the throne to her father. It sounded like a joke, like something out of a play. But strangely, he could tell she wasn't joking. The Count took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, asking why didn't Roland come in person? Andrea, as if anticipating the question, smiled and replied if the nobles of Dawn were willing to gather all their forces for a direct confrontation, she's sure Roland would seriously consider that option. But right now, His Majesty has bigger enemies to deal with. Bigger enemies? The Count frowned, unable to imagine what could be more pressing than uniting the kingdoms. What could possibly be more important? Andrea locked eyes with him, her tone turning serious as she spoke slowly and deliberately. Demons.